It suddenly got so quiet. It is good to see everyone this morning. Glad we can be here together and study and worship God together. We are continuing our class through Acts. We're going to be in Acts 17 today. Several really interesting things to cover in there. Of course, several things that are often quoted, but hopefully this will give us a little bit of context as well. As we begin, though, let's go ahead and start off with a word of prayer. Our God, creator of our entire universe, holy and completely and totally unchanging and eternal. Lord, to come into your presence in this way, to approach you in prayer, to even have a hope of having eternity to spend with you, Father, we cannot express our awe and our gratitude. But Father, as we consider your word that you have given us, that you have helped us to understand you and understand who you want us to be as we seek to be more like you, Father, help us to use these opportunities not only together but also individually to grow, to learn. Father, to help us to recognize just how amazing you are in your character. And not only to serve you simply because we want to be with you, we don't want to be lost and separated from you. Help us to serve you because we love who you are. Father, we pray that you would be with those who are struggling at this time. We know there are many who are struggling with health issues, with loss of loved ones. And Father, we're also mindful that throughout the world there are many struggling not only in those ways, but also with the various conflicts and difficulties that are occurring. Please help us to take opportunities to be lights in our world and our community, and help us in everything to glorify you by our decisions. We pray all this in your Son's name, through whom we have all hope. Amen. Excuse me. All right. As I said, we are in Acts chapter 17. I'm going to test this, Caleb, and see if this does work or not. All right. As we suspected, it doesn't. All right. So, we're going to start with the first section of chapter 17. Here, we first have Paul and Silas going to the area of Thessalonica. Technically, they go through Amphipolis and Apollonia first, but we're not told anything about that, so we're just going to skip over it just like Luke does. They go to Thessalonica. There, they find a synagogue of the Jews. As they go into this synagogue, they begin reasoning with the Jews. I believe here, yes, 3 different Sabbaths, so 3 weeks, they go in and they reason with the Jews. So this is not a lot of time by any means, but this is more than just one Sabbath day of interaction. We see a mixed reception, as we typically do, see a mixed reception of Jews and Gentiles both accepting the gospel. And notice what Paul says in verse 3. This Jesus, whom I proclaim to you, is the Christ. That is, he is the Messiah. I want us to make sure we remember Christ is just the Greek term for Messiah, the Greek term for Messiah, which would be kind of the Hebrew term, but means the same thing, the chosen one, the anointed one, the one who we're looking forward to, who is coming. He's telling these Jews in Thessalonica, way across the world from those living, around Jerusalem and all those other things, this Messiah that you've been hearing about to expect, this one that I'm preaching to you, that's him. Some listen, many do not. Thessalonica ultimately becomes very hostile towards Paul and Silas because of the Jews. However, you might think Thessalonica is a Gentile city. Very small population by comparison of Jews, especially when you compare it to areas in Asia Minor and other places like that. There's not many Jews in Thessalonica. Well, that doesn't stop them. Because you see what they do as we move on through chapter 17, the very beginning verses. They form a mob of the population, that is the general population. They cause an uproar. They drag some of the Christians to the authorities. And notice their claim in verse 6. These men who have turned the world upside down have come here also, and Jason has received them. They are all acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying there is another king, Jesus. And ultimately, this will result in Paul and Silas being run out of Thessalonica. Now, before we move on to Berea, a couple things that I want us to note. This is, at the very least, ironic. I think we could very easily say hypocritical, that the accusation of the Jews who hate Caesar is, this is an affront to Caesar. That's why we should be angry about this. But that's how they get the Christians run out of town. Second thing I want us to note, on a little bit of a different scale, remember I told y'all that I have a friend who went and visited some of these places? On the left here on your screen, that is the ruins of the marketplace in Thessalonica. As we mentioned last week when we were talking about Philippi, typically a city like this had one major marketplace. It was called Nagora. Well, this is Thessalonica's. And as we think about Paul, and as we read through Paul's practices, he would often go into the synagogue, certainly, and reason, but we're going to see he also, multiple times, goes into the marketplace. In Philippi, he was dragged into the marketplace to be accused before the city officials, but in Athens at least, and I don't remember if it says elsewhere here, but for sure in Athens, he's going to be reasoning, he's going to be just having public discussions about Christ in the marketplace. Well, this is one of the marketplaces. This one is in Thessalonica. They move on, Paul and Silas move on from Thessalonica to Berea. Both of these places, of course, are in what we would call northern Greece. At the time, it was considered Macedonia. They're moving through here. They go to Berea. Here again, he goes into a synagogue of the Jews. And we're told something very interesting. You probably have heard this quote a million times. These Jews are more noble than those who are in Thessalonica. They receive the word with all readiness of heart and search the scriptures daily to find out whether these things were so. And as a result, many Jews in this synagogue, as well again as some Gentiles, convert to Christianity. Here's where things get interesting. Not only do we have many of these Bereans believing, we're told a few Greek women of high standing as well as men, there doesn't seem to be any real pushback in Berea. And yet, Paul and Silas still, very shortly, get run out of town. Guess how? Jews from Thessalonica hear what's going on in Berea and travel all the way to another city. No easy feat at this time. It's not the farthest in terms of these two cities, but still, they don't have cars, so just hop in the car and go down the road. And they travel all the way to another city just to kick people out, not of their own city, but out of another city. And they pull a similar stunt. They stir up a mob. They get everyone mad. Paul immediately leaves and goes down towards Athens. Silas and Timothy hang back. Doesn't seem like it's as severe, right? Because this is outside influence causing a riot. But still, they send Paul away, and the other two remain a little while longer, and then they'll meet him in Athens. This other picture, by the way, this is in Berea. This is a statue, of course, made much later, supposed to be depicting Paul, but this is taken in Berea as well. Now, I want us to stop there. Paul in Athens is fascinating, and so we're going to spend a little bit of time there. But I want us to stop there and think about a few questions as Paul goes through Thessalonica and Berea. Let's go ahead and flip to the next slide. Maybe. We say many times, really, really admire what the guys do in the AV booth because I can't make head or tail of it. What did Thessalonica and Berea have that Philippi did not? We alluded to it a second ago. But what did they have that Philippi did not, if you remember last week? Do what? A synagogue. Philippi doesn't have enough Jews to have a synagogue, which means there are practically like maybe less than 10 male Jews in the entire city. We know there are several women who are Jews, but we're not told of hardly anyone else. Thessalonica and Berea both have synagogues. Now, a couple of reasons we might suppose for that. One reason is, as we mentioned, Philippi is a Roman colony. That is, it is a place set aside primarily for Romans to settle there, Roman legionaries, retired veterans, that kind of thing. They would settle there, get land there, and so it seems like there's a stronger Gentile influence in some ways. Thessalonica and Berea are still very much Gentile cities, but they're going to have, it seems, at least a slightly larger population of Jews. So Thessalonica and Berea have synagogues. Paul, as is his custom, he goes and begins to teach in these synagogues. Again, this is an indication not only of to the Jew first and also to the Greek, as Paul constantly talks about, but also a reminder for us that the Jews should be in the best position, no matter where they are, whether they're in Jerusalem, Judea, that area, or throughout the Roman world, the Jews should be in the best position to understand the teachings about Christ and accept them. That doesn't always seem to be the case, but that at least should be the case, and that's why Paul always starts at the synagogues. Let's go to the next question. What tactics do the Jews use to drive Paul and Silas out of Thessalonica? We alluded to this, but what tactics do they use? Do what? Okay, they try and use Rome's authority against Paul and Silas. That's one element, absolutely. What else do they do? What's another part of their strategy? Mm-hmm. Good. They don't only target Paul and Silas, they target the people that Paul and Silas are staying with, who are hosting them, who are letting them stay in their homes. So they try and make this unsustainable for them to stay there because they're trying to even turn their hosts, not necessarily against them, but like make it impossible for them to stay there. What else? What's another part of their tactic? We said that they stir up a crowd. Who do they stir up, if you look in the text? Do they stir up the nobles, the men and who are, we're concerned, very concerned about the welfare of our city? They do eventually take it to the authorities, but they stir up a mob. They stir up, how should I put this? Okay, good. They stir up what would be considered the rabble in the area. In other words, and this is very important for us, they stir up the people that the Jews, the Pharisees, the ones who are, of Jesus' day, of the early church days, that are trying to be so holy, they stir up the people that these Jews would consider untouchables. And they use them to do their dirty work. You see what's happening here. Not only are they trying to use Rome as a weapon against their enemies, and they hate Rome, they're also using the rabble against their enemies, and they hate the rabble. They're having everyone else do their dirty work for them. That's the situation that we have in Thessalonica and how the Jews use this. Which, of course, then creates as a contrast, we'll go to the next slide, with the people in Berea. We mentioned this, but I want us to make sure we caught exactly what is said. These were more noble than those in Thessalonica, and they received the word with all diligence, searched the scriptures daily to find out whether these things were so. Who was it that was more noble? Good. It's not the city as a whole that he's talking about. He's saying when he goes to the synagogue, the people sitting in the synagogue, primarily Jews, they are the ones who are more noble. In other words, if we were, for example, as some scholars have tried to say, which frustrates me, if we were to try and make a case in Acts that Paul just doesn't like Jews anymore, that he's trying to constantly villainize Jews and just make Jews the bad guy, almost in a racist way, which would be ironic if Paul is a Jew. But anyway, some people have tried to make that case, right? That, Paul just doesn't like the Jews anymore because he's a Christian now, and so he's trying to just paint all Jews in a bad light. Well, he's very complimentary of the Jews in Berea. Why? What are they seeking as they are listening to Paul's statements? They're seeking the truth, and where are they seeking it? What scriptures? Good. The Old Testament prophets. They have the Old Testament. Obviously, the New Testament hasn't been written yet. They have the Old Testament. Think about how often Peter and Paul have built their case for Christ primarily on fulfilled prophecies from the Old Testament scriptures. So what are they doing? They're being told, if you go to this passage in the Old Testament, if you go to this text, if you go to this, well, then this is predicting exactly what happened with Jesus of Nazareth. Well, what are these Jews in Berea doing? Well, A, they're listening, but they're not just listening and just saying, oh, this guy said it, so it must be true. They're going back. They're pulling out their scrolls. They're looking and seeing, okay, I'm seeing with my own eyes. This is, in fact, matching up with what this guy who is preaching to us is telling us. They're doing their homework. So it's not only an openness to hear, it's an openness to hear with a desire to find truth and looking for the evidence to make sure that that truth is, in fact, true. It's backed up. That's why they're more noble. That's why these men are, or these Jews are commended. Because they are going through this process. That is meant to be, and I would argue this is why, one of the reasons Luke does this, that's meant to be a model for us. Just very briefly, because I do want to get to Athens, both literally and in class. But when we look at this text, this is meant to be a model for how we approach our own study, our own growth, our own learning together. Something that, and I talk sometimes with our students at the school and also with just friends of mine and stuff like that, who are in ministry. We are very intent within the church in saying, we don't do creeds. We don't do, human authorities. We don't have, someone that's over a bunch of churches. We don't do any of that. We're opposed to that. We don't believe that's scriptural, which it's not. And yet, how often do we subtly just accept, oh, well, brother so-and-so wrote this in a commentary, and I respect him greatly, so I'm not even going to check on what he wrote. Or brother so-and-so preached this from a pulpit, and I love his preaching, so I'm not even going to check on. We need to be like the Bereans. If you hear me say something, I don't want you to just say, oh, Neil said that, so we're good to go. Check it out. Go to the scriptures. Make sure I'm telling you the truth. Not because I'm ever going to intentionally lie, but because I can make mistakes too. That's the model of the Bereans. That's what we are supposed to imitate. All right, if you get a chance to pull the next slide up, we'll go ahead and do that. We're going to move on to Athens now. Athens, it's just such a fun, I use the term episode again. We're talking about true stories here, but it's kind of divided into different sections. Paul gets to Athens. It seems like this isn't even really a place he's planning on spending much time. We'll go one more slide over. He's not even really planning on spending much time there, it seems. But as he looks throughout the city, he sees idols everywhere. Now, we might wonder why. Well, this is in many ways the heart of Greek culture, which means it is also the heart of the origins of Greek religion in many ways. Now, I'll go ahead and describe what we're looking at here on the screen as we move through the story. What you're seeing up top is called the Acropolis. Essentially, that means city on a hill. Except, this is not really the city itself. This is a religious complex primarily. Temple upon temple upon temple. This was taken within a year or so from now, so you can see how much of the ruins of these temples still remain today up on the Acropolis. All sorts of pagan temples up on this place that have been there for centuries, even by the time that Paul gets there, many of them. Now this hill that the picture's taken from, as some might guess, is the Areopagus. This, do what? Mars Hill. Of course, Mars Hill, that's the Roman name for Ares, and Ares would be what they would call it, so it's potato. But as we look at this hill, as we're going to see in just a moment, this is where Paul stood to deliver his message at the latter part of Acts 17. Now, we don't know exactly what rock he stood on, right? But this is where he stood, on the Areopagus, with that in the background. A giant menagerie of different pagan temples scattered all over. That's what's right behind him as he is going to offer a message, as we'll see, about the nature of divinity. So, Paul is in Athens. He is going to begin seeing all this idolatry, and he can't handle it, right? Might think, you mentioned Isaiah earlier, we might think about Isaiah saying it was caught up in my bones. I think it was Isaiah, or was it Jeremiah? It's caught up in my bones to where I just have to speak it. I can't keep silent. Well, that's kind of the sense that we get of Luke's description of Paul here. He's really just kind of traveling through Athens, or at least that seems to be the plan. He's just waiting on Silas and Timothy, but he's got to speak up. And so he begins, we're told, he begins to go not only to the synagogue of the Jews, there's a synagogue in Athens as well, but he goes also in the marketplace. And he is just talking with everyone he can possibly talk to about the message of God, and specifically the message of Christ. Now we're told about two groups in particular that hear him as he is speaking: the Epicureans and the Stoics. So we're going to spend the next 30 minutes talking about the details of Epicurean and Stoic philosophy. No, that's boring. Epicurean and Stoic philosophy, though, were the two of the primary schools of philosophy in not only this area, but really throughout the Roman world. Just an interesting aside, if you've ever seen the movie Gladiator, the first one specifically, if you actually study the writings of Stoicism, it seems that they actually tried to model kind of the script of the movie and kind of the tone of the movie after that brand of Greek philosophy. It's kind of subtle, but I was watching a really good video kind of explaining how they did this. Stoicism primarily focused on kind of the removal of yourself, in the sense that whatever's beyond my control is beyond my control, and that just is what it is. I should be perfectly content with however my life is right now. Whereas Epicureanism was more along the lines of, I should pursue the highest forms of pleasure. Now, that's often confused with hedonism. That is just, I'm going to do whatever I want to, eat, drink, and be merry, right? That's not actually what Epicureanism was. Epicureanism was, I'm seeking the highest forms of pleasure, which might be, friendship and things like that. But the Stoics and the Epicureans, they constantly had, I wouldn't even call them debates, but discussions, philosophical discussions with each other about the merits of different ways of thinking. And Athens is not only the center, in many ways, of Greek culture, and had been for several hundred years by this point. It's also, because it's the center of Greek culture, not only the center of Greek religion, but the center of Greek philosophy. So as Paul is speaking these things about Christ, both Epicurean and Stoic philosophers hear what he's saying, and they begin to think, this is new. And some of them just brush it off. What does this babbler have to say? But others say, no, he seems to be sharing some new religion. And this is where Luke gives us a little bit of interesting tidbit about the Athenians, especially at this time, although I think this would be accurate throughout several periods of Athenian history. They love to talk about new things. Anytime there's some new idea, some new concept, some new way of doing things, they're all over it. They want to hear it. They want to listen. This comes both from their philosophical background. This also comes somewhat from their political background. Athens tried some very interesting political experiments over their history. They're interested in new stuff. And so finally, the ones who are more curious win out over the ones who are dismissive, and they bring Paul up to the Areopagus, which is what you see on the screen, and they say, tell us about this thing you're talking about. And that's where Paul gives, personally, one of my favorite presentations, not even, I would say, of the gospel, as we'll see in a second, but just presentations about God that's recorded for us in Acts. We'll go ahead and read this. As he is standing in the midst of the Areopagus, again, as we can see, with the Acropolis right behind him, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious." Some translations say pious. I think that's also valid. "For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, 'To the unknown God.' What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God, and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he is actually not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we indeed are his offspring. Being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of man. The times of ignorance God overlooked. But now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead." When people hear him specifically talk about God raising someone from the dead, once again, some are dismissive. Others are still curious. We want to hear again what you have to say about this. Tell us more at some future time here very soon. Some ultimately follow Paul and convert to Christianity. We're told, and this is always fascinating to me, Dionysius the Areopagite. Again, the Areopagus, that's just this one hill. So to call him the Areopagite, at least best I can understand, most likely means this is just where he hangs out all the time. This is like, calling someone the Dairy Queen dude or something like that, right? That's just where they always are. You can always find them at Dairy Queen, right? You can always find this guy up on the Areopagus. Perhaps because he's always curious. He always wants to hear what people are talking about. And he converts. We also have Damaris, a woman there, others with them. So a few do convert. As we think about Paul up on the Areopagus or Mars Hill, I do want us to think about a few things. Let's switch to the next slide. Number one, I want us to think about what God does here. Does Paul perform any miracles while he's in Athens? Maybe, but there's none recorded, right? That's not part of the narrative that we're given. So how does God give Paul a providential opportunity in Athens? He doesn't do anything miraculous for him, but what does he do? Okay, so Paul does a great job contextualizing the gospel. How is he able to do that? What is God's role in this? Okay, good. You have to understand the mind of people that you're trying to reach. What are we told about the Athenians? They're very pious or very religious. They care about the divine. Now, in their minds, the divine is all this different pantheon of gods, right? But they care a lot about the divine. They also are very curious. They like talking. They like learning. That's a providential opportunity. Meaning, I'm not saying God made them, worship false gods. I'm saying God puts Paul in a situation where there are opportunities for him to connect with these people. We've talked a lot, and I just want to briefly mention it, since we've already talked about it a lot, but we see the same thing in our culture. Even when, in many ways, I would argue our culture is disturbing, let's just put it that way, think about the opportunities that we have that I would argue, in some ways, have been carved out through providence as a silver lining to the negative. Because, for example, our society has leaned so far into relativism and your truth and my truth, there is no objective truth. We've talked about that's created a degree of uncertainty to where people want stability, to where people are searching for something. That is an incredible opportunity for the church because Christ provides stability. Christ provides answers. That's an opportunity. That's an opportunity. We might put it in terms of Jesus speaking to one of the churches in Revelation 2 and 3. That's an open door that God has provided for the church if we will take that opportunity. That's what Paul does here, is ultimately he sees where the Athenians are and he chooses to pursue that. Does he? Yes. Yes. Good. Very good. He starts where they are, and he doesn't start where they are and then immediately tear down where they are. He starts where they are and redirects it, uses it, builds on it in a positive way. That's where sometimes I think we make mistakes. And I'm saying just us in general. Many times I've seen Christians so intent and with the best intentions on helping people to learn the truth and to dispense with false doctrine, but they start by tearing down things that the person believes. Those things do have to be torn down eventually, right? We do have to help people see this is incorrect. But 9 times out of 10, when Jesus or the apostles are addressing someone who needs to correct something, they start with something they understand correctly, with something that gives them a positive direction to move. And then we can address some of these things that need to be dispensed with, but we're starting where they are, and we're building on that. Excuse me. And that's where you see Paul doing here as well. Let's go ahead and switch to the next slide. I'm going to get a drink. Oh, back one. There we go. How does Paul begin his address? I see you are very religious, so that's starting where they are. We care about the things of the divine. And what's the example he uses? I see this altar. Now, does Paul see this because this is the main altar in Athens? No. This would have been some obscure little altar tucked away somewhere that you would have to do a little bit of digging to find, almost certainly. Which means Paul is doing his homework, as we mentioned earlier, to find out a little more about these people, what they think, how they tick, if you will. What makes them tick? There we go. My brain's not working this morning. To the unknown God. Now, let's just ask the question. Why would they have an altar to the unknown God at all? I mean, they have so many gods. Why would they have an altar to the unknown God? In case they missed one. Yes, Landon? Yes. Good. They were doing this in case they missed one, but perhaps also because there's a missing piece, right? Steve? Yes. Yes, that's a great example. Religions like Hinduism often do something similar where they try and reach out to all the different possible deities because they want to connect to all that. They don't want to miss anything. Well, that provides us with opportunities, even today in those kind of contexts. So Paul here is basically saying, you have this God, he's the unknown God that you have an altar to. He uses that as an opportunity to talk about the one true God. Now, let's move to the next slide because this is where I think sometimes we don't really understand what Paul is actually doing here. What is Paul's goal in this speech? I'm not saying what's his goal overall. We know what his goal is going on his missionary journey. What is his goal in this speech? Okay. Good. Yes. Very good. One thing he's doing is creating a connection. Landon mentioned he quotes from Greek poets. Now, very briefly, we're going to talk about this a little bit in a couple weeks, but Paul quoting from the Greek poets doesn't mean he believes that everything these pagan Greek poets wrote is true. It means, A, that this particular thing they wrote, in this case, he finds merit to that he's tying in to something that has greater truth. Paul and others sometimes quote people to try and say, hey, this person's on the right track and you already agree with him, let's go this way. Other times they'll quote people to say, hey, you believe in this guy, and they're actually speaking against you. We're going to see that more in a couple weeks. But either way, Paul is quoting someone here that in this case is meant to build a connection with them. What else do we see in terms of the goal of Paul's speech? He's certainly trying to make a connection. Yes. Good. This speech is not designed to give them answers as much as designed to continue to stoke their curiosity to learn even more. That's another thing that we can really learn from it. Again, I told y'all, I really love Acts 17 for several reasons. Far too often, we want to give everyone all the answers all at once for everything they need to know about God. That's not what Paul's doing here at all. Paul gives them very few answers. He is creating more and more and more curiosity while still directing them in the right way. But ultimately, this is designed for the long term, not the short term. This is designed for the exact response he gets toward the end. Some of these, I'm right here. We will hear you again about this. That's what he's looking for with this speech. Because as we're going to talk about in just a second, if this is all he gives, they don't have enough information yet. What else is the goal of Paul's speech? There's another thing that we haven't touched on yet. Okay, good. The Acropolis in the background with all of these different gods. They have all their mythology. They have this whole pantheon. And I mean, if any of y'all have studied any kind of Greek mythology whatsoever, and even if you haven't technically, you probably know a lot of it. You just don't realize it comes from Greek mythology. It's fascinating stuff. I mean, it's really just fun to read if it's just fiction, right? If we're just reading it as fiction. So they have this whole fleshed out idea of what it means for a being to be divine. They have this whole idea of what divinity means. And let me tell you what that entails for a Greek. In the Greek mind, divinity means power, but not morality. Almost all the gods, if not all the gods, were recorded as acting immorally multiple times. The gods are not moral beings, but they're just simply powerful beings. The gods are also very humanesque beings. They eat, they sleep, they have relations with one another, they have children, they murder each other, they betray each other, they do all sorts of things that humans do. While, according to Scripture, humans are made in the image of God. For the Greek, not literally, but in terms of how they are formed, the Greeks are made in the image of man, or rather the gods are made in the image of man. That's the image of divinity that the Greeks have. So what does Paul do here? He's taking the very concept of divinity itself and redirecting what they think divinity is to a more accurate understanding of what it actually is. I would argue that while curiosity and the idea of making a connection are absolutely part of the goal, The primary goal, I would argue, of Paul's speech is to begin moving their minds towards a better understanding of divinity that's not tied to human-esque figures, that's not tied merely to the exercise of power without morality, that's tied to something greater. Notice as Paul goes through this speech, he talks about we should recognize that God is the one who created the world and everything in it. Well, for them, many of the gods had many different roles and all that. He's saying, no, God is the one who made everything. Not only that, he sustains everything. Not only that, he made human beings of one kind. There are many different aspects of various mythologies that would have, some gods make or be patrons of this group over here and others be patrons of this group over here. No, God made everyone from one blood. We also see, don't think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone. This is an image formed by art and the imagination of man. Now, we've mentioned before, the Greeks and any other pagan that you can name, they didn't actually believe the stone itself was that's all that there is to their God. They believed that was a representation of the gods. Now, some of them would believe that the essence of the God was infused in that image once it was consecrated or something like that. But what he's saying is, the image you have created that you think represents your God, we shouldn't think that that's an accurate representation. When you look at that statue, you need to stop thinking that gives you a sense of what divinity looks like, because it doesn't. That's what he's saying here. He's trying to redefine their understanding of divinity. Let's move to the next slide. Now, this is important as we wrap up. What is missing from Paul's presentation? What does Paul not include? Yes? At the very end of his speech, you're exactly right, he mentions a man who will judge the world in righteousness and who has been raised from the dead. Doesn't name Jesus, doesn't give any context for Jesus, doesn't even explain that this was not merely a man, but also God in the flesh. Certainly nothing about what must I do to be saved. Certainly nothing about the gospel as we think of it. Just a brief allusion at the end to Jesus without even naming Jesus. Why? He's planting a seed. He's continuing to provoke curiosity. Who is this man? Tell us more. And he knows they're not ready yet. If they don't understand the basic nature of divinity, this is why, with Peter in Acts 2, he can get all the way to what must I do to be saved, because they already understand God to a great degree. These people don't understand deity, much less what must I do to be saved. They've got a long ways to go. So what are we going to do? We're going to get them there, but we've got to take it step by step. We want to be recognizing the urgency, right? This is not something where Paul is trying to move slow so that they don't ever get all the information they need to get. But, let me just use a workplace example. Have you ever, in a job, had someone try to explain to you everything that you need to do for some specific task, and they just dumped it all on you at once, just boom, 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 and then the next day you were supposed to do it? How well did that go? It takes time. It takes practicing. It takes step by step by step. If you try and rush it, you're not going to end up with any kind of successful outcome. Paul wants to plant the seed. I love what you said a second ago. He wants to plant the seed because it takes time for that seed to germinate. It takes time, it takes watering, it takes God giving the increase, but all of that takes time. And for Paul not to include the entirety of everything they need to know all at once, that's not an omission on his part. That's a recognition of where the people he is talking to are at. And therefore, where we need to start and where we need to go from here. Once again, a lesson I would argue we can learn. There's a book, we might go over this book, in fact, sometime in a future class, we'll see, but there's a book that I've come across fairly recently that someone introduced to me. Love this book. Something it talks about in there. Your job is not necessarily to be the one that gives them everything they need to the point that they become immersed into Christ. Your job is to take them from where they are now and get them the next step forward. And if that's all you are able to do, God in His providence will provide someone else to get them the next step forward, the next step, and the next step. You get them as far as you can, but step by step. Because otherwise, if you rush it, you're more likely to drive them away than to actually help them come to a knowledge of the truth themselves. That's what Paul's doing. He's getting them the next way forward. And we don't know if some of these people got to hear Paul give them the next step after that. But by the time he left, there were other Christians in Athens who could pick up where he left off. We'll stop there. We're out of time. Next week, I will be gone, and we will have, I believe, Myron teaching from Acts 18. Thank you all so much.